Today, Matt and I are going to talk to you about interactive library learning objects for everyone, accessibility in H5P. Just a bit of an introduction. I'm Joanne, and I'm the instructional technology librarian at Wilfrid Laurier University Library. I chair our online instruction group and co-chair our library accessibility committee, as well as my regular liaison staff. Matt here is also a member
Joanne, I think
of our online instruction group, and also, can you not hear me?
no, you blipped out for a second there, Joanne. You're back. Yeah.
So Matt also is co-chair of the Libraries Accessibility Committee and is our liaison librarian for business at Laurier. We, just to start off with a bit of a caveat that Matt and I are not accessibility experts and we make no claims to be. We have been interested in accessibility issues for a number of years. And so the things that we're going to share with you today are things that we've found in our regular practice, and we just want to share some tips with you based on what we've experienced. First of all, this session today is going to be focused on H5P, but a lot of the things that we're talking about are also going to be applicable to other kinds of accessibility in different learning objects that are created with different software. So some things will be specific to H5P and some things will be more general. In general, I hope most of you already know about H5P. We've had other sessions that talked about it. And it's something that I've heard mentioned a number of times as well in different presentations. So I'm hoping that most of you are familiar with H5P at this point. If not, just very quickly, it's an open source tool that allows you to quite easily create nice, shareable, interactive online learning objects. We use it quite a lot at Laurier, and it's been a wonderful tool for engaging students and doing our, especially our asynchronous instruction during the pandemic. So we really have been happy with it. In Ontario, anybody who works for a college or university has access to H5P through eCampus Studio. If you don't work for an Ontario college or university, there are other ways you can access H5P, but that's not really something we're going to talk too much about today. H5P has more than 40 different kinds of what are called content types. So different types of online learning objects that you can create with it. And so it's really there's so many different options. They're usually quite easy to create, and they're a really good resource for interactive instruction with students. The real question we are going to talk about today is whether or not it's accessible. And we're going to talk about a few things. First, we're going to go over to making sure that the H5P learning object types that you choose are accessible. And then we're going to do most of the rest of the presentation on making sure that the content you put into H5P is accessible. I'm going to give some general tips, and then Matt's going to talk about universal design for learning and how that can be applied in H5P. And then at the end, we'll have just a little bit about testing, so that some basic testing you can do to see how accessible or whether or not your learning objects that you create are accessible. So first, choosing accessible H5P content types. H5P actually for an online instruction tool is pretty accessible. It's more accessible than many things that I have encountered, but it's very far from perfect. Not all of the 40+ content types in H5P are accessible. So it's really important as like a baseline starting out to make sure that the content types that you're using in your instruction are actually accessible. And how can you tell? Basically, they tell you. If you Google H5P and accessibility, you'll find that there's this handy chart which goes over each of the different H5P content types and tells you if it's accessible or not. So this is just a bit of a part of one of the chart, and you can potentially see here that some of the content types are in red, like personality quiz, questionnaire, speak the words here, and in the large column in the middle they say no. And those are things that are judged not to be accessible by the H5P core team, and they don't recommend that you use those things. So we don't recommend that you use them either. It's really helpful to make sure that you're choosing ones that have been tested and shown to be accessible and are on this list as okay to use. Some of them, it's a little, like sometimes there are some that have caveats, like the audio content type is accessible, but it says on here, obviously you need to provide a transcript or it's not going to be accessible. Or, you know, there are some that are accessible as long as, so there are some that have some notes to say, if you do this, then it's accessible. So pay attention to those as well. Also, one of the columns in this chart is browser support, and so please remember to take a look at that as well. Most of them are supported in all the major browsers, but for some of them, like some of the ones in red here on this chart, you can see it says Chrome only, for example, or unknown. So you want to make sure that you not only select things that are accessible, but that you know that are going to work well in all the different browsers. A couple of caveats. It's never obviously black and white and super straightforward and easy with accessibility. So even if you pick a content type that is it says in the chart that it's accessible, you want to think a little bit about what that means. So it's a little bit unclear, I find, what accessibility means in that H5P chart. There's a bit of a description at the top that talks about how they determine this. But it's not very detailed. So it says, for example, that they check against WCAG 2.1, but it doesn't really give any details about what each of the content, well, it doesn't give any of the details about which content types did, you know, well and not well in certain aspects. I mean, anybody doing web accessibility checking knows that things are rarely perfect, right? So there's no details about any of those shades of gray or what those might be in any of the content types, and or what it means to get a passing grade. They also specify that they test with certain tools. So obviously there are other tools they don't test with, and so we're not always entirely certain if they're going to be accessible in every kind of, obviously in every kind of assistive technology that people might be using. So there certainly aren't guarantees. Also, I have found, and others at Laurier who've been using these, that there are a little bit of accessibility quirks, is what I call them, in certain content types. So even if the content type says it's accessible, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to absolutely work perfectly all the time for everybody. And some of that has to do with with choices that you can make about which settings you use, for example, in some of the content types. And I'll give you a couple of examples here based on some that I've used and some experiences I've had. The first one is the audio content type. This one is actually pretty accessible, but the default player is minimalistic when you go in there to choose to create your learning object. And I found that the minimalistic player is not very accessible, but the full player is accessible. So you'd have to know to go in there and choose the full player to make sure that it's accessible rather than the one that they give you as a default. Also, there are some options in here that would detract from accessibility if you chose them, like enable autoplay. Obviously, we don't want to have things that talk playing automatically when somebody goes to a page, because that's really confusing and difficult for people who use screen readers that also talk to manage. Also, it's just plain annoying for everybody to have stuff start playing automatically on the screen. So if you chose that, obviously that would detract a little bit from accessibility for people who use screen reading, or from the usability at least of it for people who use screen reading software. Obviously, if something is presented in an audio only format, it's not going to be accessible unless you use a transcript. And often, like with this content type, there's not really a good way to incorporate that in your H5P learning object. So there's no, so I can easily embed a nice audio file created using this content type, but within H5P, there's no way for me to actually embed a transcript as well. I have to do that separately. So there are some things like that that are bits of an issue sometimes in H5P. The second one I wanted to bring up is image hotspot, which is one I really like. And this one works pretty well for accessibility. The only issues I have come up with is that there are like label or heading fields, and you have to make sure that those have meaningful names, because that's what screen readers will use when they're reading this. So if you don't have meaningful names in there, then it's not going to make a lot of sense to people. So it partly depends on what you put in there, how accessible it is. The other little quirk I have found is that screen readers will read all of the hotspots, but not necessarily in the order that you expect them to read them in. So in this example that I have, for example, it's kind of a linear, like I would expect kind of that people who were sighted would read this, the hotspots on this from left to right, but the screen reader doesn't read them like that. It's kind of random. So I always recommend for content types like this to create an alternate text version where you put the different hotspots in there and somebody can access it in a different way if it matters that it's read in a linear way. Sometimes it doesn't matter and it's okay. The last one I'm going to talk about briefly is course presentation. This is one I have used a lot. And here's an example of one of mine. They actually are pretty good with accessibility, except, and this is a big except, the little arrow buttons that you have to use at the bottom to go from slide to slide are really, if you're using screen reading software, they're really confusing and hard to use, and they read out some weird sounding stuff. So it's kind of, so it's accessible, but it's a little bit confusing and difficult for people who use screen reading software to actually use. So there's some, little bits of usability issues there, I think. So I'm mentioning these not necessarily to be discouraging. I think that it's, for the most part, these work well. I just think it's helpful for us to understand, obviously, that if we are using something, even if it says it's accessible, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work absolutely perfectly for everybody who's going to be using it. So it's still important to be aware of the kinds of issues that might come up and to try to use strategies that will try to minimize those issues for people. In this case, for example, for the course presentation, there are different things you could do. There are also other content type containers, like a column, for example, that reads a little bit easier for people with screen reading software. So, there are just different things to think about when deciding what you want to do. The next big section that we have that we want to talk about is making sure that the content that you actually put into your H5P learning object is accessible. Obviously, that's important because even if you're using something that's by default accessible in the container, the stuff that you put in it needs to be accessible too. So I'm just going to go over a few really basic tips for some basic accessibility, because basic is always helpful. Even for those of us who know it already, it's always useful, I find, to get a bit of a reminder. So the first thing I always ask myself when I'm putting online instructional content together in something like H5P, it's what kind of content am I putting in there and who's being left out? So if I'm putting in something that's visual, for example, can people who have vision impairments get that information in some way? Or if I'm putting up something that's audio and somebody has a hearing impairment, how can they get that information? If I have something that requires the use of a mouse, like some H5P learning objects do, like the drag and drop, for example, then, is there a way that, can people who can't use a mouse for various reasons do that as well? So there are different, so I like to just think, if I'm doing something here, what is it that is presenting a barrier for somebody? And the usual way that we like to use to overcome these kinds of issues is to present information in multiple ways. So obviously, if I'm presenting an image, I would want to put in alt text for people who can't see the image and are using screen reading software. So I'll want to put in some descriptive alt text that explains the point that I'm trying to make by having the image there, so that people get the same information as they would if they were sighted. One of the things, it's also useful if the image is complex, by the way, like a chart or a graph or some other kinds of something that's conveying a lot of information, to put in a longer description as well. Both of those things are options within H5P, and so I just recommend that you use them whenever you need to. One on the alt text, I find it's helpful myself to try, like if I have an image of something, I want to put that also, the same information also in text format. So I like to have it in both. And I find that just makes it a little bit easier, even for the students who are sighted, because then they have a better sense of what it is I'm trying to convey by having that image there. So in that way, I find it's helpful just to have a description of what it is you're trying to get across with the image and just in text. I find that's more helpful for more people. Similar thing, obviously, for audio or for video. Audio, clearly, you need to have some kind of text transcription or some other way for people who can't hear your audio to get the information. And for video, obviously, captions are very helpful for people who can't hear as well. Definitely, in my experience, it helps tremendously to try to think about these things in your initial workflow as you're creating your learning object, because that can save a huge amount of time. If I'm doing a podcast, for example, or a video, and then I have to transcribe it all afterwards in order to do a transcript or captions, that takes forever. But if I plan this from the beginning, then it can really not take very much extra time at all. And it can also, in my experience, result in a better result. So for example, I do scripts for video. So at Laurier, we do scripts for videos. We have a small group of people who do those. And one of the things that we did, which I found to be really helpful, was at one point was we went through the videos and we counted how many words per minute people spoke on an average, so that we got some kind of formula for there's X amount of words per minute in a video. So that's really helped me a lot when planning my videos, because I do my script first with my storyboard, and I can tweak that because I know how, like, if I want this video to be, 2 minutes, then, I can do that all in advance before I do any of the work on the actual recording or narration of the video. Before I did that, I'd first do the video and then I'd say, oh, that's like 3.5 minutes and it's only supposed to be 2. And then I'd have to go back and chop a lot out and redo a lot of work. And this way I can get everything pretty much ready to go and then just do my narration and my recording, and it's much quicker. And then I have the script already and I can use that either for a transcript or for my captions very easily. So I find that, incorporating it into the process is really helpful, both in terms of, for me at least, in terms of workflow and time saving as well. A couple of other tips I'll go through fairly quickly. It's very helpful for accessibility to make sure that you're consistent in your formatting and your structuring of the information on the page. This is just an example here for example, of a course presentation I did where I have my main point consistently on the left-hand side, and then I had an example of my main point on the right-hand side. So students kind of get used to what the structure of the learning object is, and don't have to be guessing every time what they should be looking at. Also, it's very important to make things very easy to read. So make sure you use big fonts and high contrast between your text and your background, and make your images large and simple and clear so that you can read them well. This is, I find this has been an interesting thing to try to do in H5P, because there's not really a lot of room for text there. So I found that it's been a useful exercise for me trying to think, okay, what really is my key point here? And how can I convey that in as few words as I can? So I think it's a really helpful instructional exercise to try to pare your points down to their absolute minimum and try to make sure that they fit nicely on there and are clear for everybody. It also really helps for just making it readable on mobile phones as well, because H5P is quite usable in mobile friendly. This is one of my pet peeves. We don't do it a whole lot in library instruction, but I see it all over the place, where charts and graphs and other kinds of things use color to convey meaning, and that's obviously just not very helpful for people who can't see colors well. This is an example that I got from the Microsoft website showing people how to do charts, and at least this one is a little bit better than many, because there's the bars are in the same order as the years in the legend, but so you might be able to guess if you couldn't see the red and the blue, which are terrible colors for people with color blindness. Then you might be able to guess at least what they are based on the order, but you wouldn't be entirely sure about that. So it's really important, obviously, not to convey anything with actual meaning in color. And I see this more often than I would think I would. So one of the last things I want to recommend is considering creating an alternate text version wherever you can. I think for the most part, it's not a requirement for accessibility, but I think it's really good best practice to get into. Partly that's just because it creates a different alternative for people who can't access the information in a certain way. It's a really good universal design for learning principle. Matt's going to talk about that in a minute, to present information in multiple ways. So I think it's a really good best practice guideline. As I mentioned in some of my examples earlier, it isn't necessarily always that something is not accessible, but sometimes it's just not very user friendly. So if I'm using a screen reader, I just might not want to tackle that, right? I might not be in the mood to do something difficult right now. So I might just want something that's, in a text format that's a lot easier for me to deal with. And often I find in H5P, this is relatively easy to do. Like in some of mine, like the hotspot one I mentioned earlier, I just had text in there and you can pretty easily cut and paste it into a Word document. So that's all it takes sometimes to create an alternate text version. So if it's easy to do, I always recommend doing that. And here's just an example of this is what this looks like on our website. Here's my image hotspot, and I just have a little link to the text version underneath it. Unfortunately, again, there isn't often a way to do that within the H5P learning object. So it's something that you actually need to do on the page that you have the H5P learning object on. So that's what I have for you. Matt is going to take over now and talk to you more about how you can make sure your content is accessible by using universal design principles. I'm going to stop and transfer this for a second.
Thank you so much, Joanne. And I will share my screen. 1 second. There we go. Okay, so hi everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about universal design for learning and its application within H5P. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk through a couple main concepts, and then I'm going to go over into one of the learning objects that I've created in H5P and just talk a little bit about ways that I kept universal design in mind as I was creating it. So just let me minimize something. There we go. That's better. So just to kind of cover the basics of universal design, when we talk about universal design for learning, we're thinking about making ways of making learning accessible for everyone, regardless of their abilities or anything along those lines. So we're kind of just thinking of ways to make our learning environments and the way that students are engaging with learning simple and accessible regardless. So having UDL or using UDL means that you want to have an intentional focus on guiding your instruction. So you go into your instruction, you go into creating your learning objects with the idea that regardless of who it is that's coming to your learning objects or coming to your instruction tools, that they will be able to use those tools and get the same content out of it or get the same pace learning out of it, regardless of learning disabilities or needs or any type of accessible needs. And we're really creating learning environments that meet a variety of learning needs, as I say there. Did that work? There we go. So universal design follows 3 major guidelines. So within those 3 major guidelines, you have multiple means of engagement. In other words, the why of learning, and I'll go into this a bit more in just a few minutes. Multiple means of representation, in other words, the what of learning, so what it is that we are giving to students, and multiple means of action and expression, in other words, the how of learning. So within those 3 guidelines, you want to kind of be taking into consideration how are you engaging your students, how are you using your H5P to be able to cover the bases to provide as many multiple means. And that's really the kind of key point when we talk about UDL, is you want to have multiple means of each of these sorts of levels. So go into a little bit deeper there with engagement, or the why of learning. So here we want to make sure that we are providing learners with different ways to engage the material. So for example, if I am working with students who are very text-based and want to kind of sit down and read and they process information that way, maybe I want to use the content type called column, where you just present your information all in one kind of long text-based column. If, for example, I'm working with a visual learner, and I know that visual learners are going to be engaging with my material, I may want to have some interactive videos where students can follow along the individual material and kind of stop it and have interactive moments. Or perhaps, as Joanne demonstrated a moment ago, you might want to use hotspot images where the student can be looking at a specific image related to the content that I'm talking about, with small pieces of information embedded within that image. If I'm working with students who learn by doing or tactile learners, I may want to engage with some of the more heavily interactive type of H5P material. For example, I might want to have a series of quizzes embedded within a interactive video or embedded within the column to make sure that those students are also engaging with that. Or I might want to use something like drag and drop. And that way I can have students who are actually dragging material across the screen and matching up ideas in that way. So the point there is that as I kind of work with my H5P, I don't want to say to myself, I'm just going to use a column, or I'm just going to use a course presentation. I want to ask myself, what would be a good way to integrate multiple different ways of learning so that when students sit down with the H5P learning object to work through the problem or work through the process or work through the content, that regardless of who it is that's coming to that is going to be able to engage with it and work with it in a way that they can pull something out of learning. With representation, so here I'm presenting information. So previously it was, how am I going to engage? Now I'm presenting that information. So for example, I may want to, with text-based learners, I may want to have textual description. I might want to spend a lot of time describing what it is that I'm doing, or making sure that they can kind of follow through and read the different processes that I'm working on. If I'm working with a visual learner, I'm probably going to want to integrate some videos, maybe with some demonstrations. I might want to have different charts, or again, I might want some images. And again, there, maybe I want to have images with hotspots that are attributed to that particular image. But I just want to make sure that the information that I'm giving them is going to be able to be processed in a way that they can fully understand. And again, with tactile learners who learn by doing, I want to integrate some different activities or interactivity into my H5P learning objects. Again, that could be quizzes, that could be multiple choice options, that even could be long form answers that I can embed in different forms of my learning object. And then we come to the action and expression bit. And this is often the one that people sometimes are unsure of how to best engage with this in H5P. But really, when you're talking about action and expression, you're just trying to make sure that the students are, this is sort of the assessment piece. So how are students going to learn by doing, or how are they going to assess their learning? And one of the things that I often talk about and think about when I'm creating my H5P learning objects is I'm integrating smaller chunks. I'm scaffolding the learning so that students can go at a reasonable pace, so that they can do self-paced learning and they can kind of work through different stages of it so that it's not just one large chunk of assessment at the very end. And so with, for example, maybe I want text-based learners, I may want to have a number of short answer options after each concept. So perhaps in a course presentation or a column, I've kind of talked about different concepts. And then the next piece of, the next little element in my H5P might be a chance for them to write up some of their different answers. With visual learners, again, I want to kind of come into image-based activities. And again, I come back to the idea of drag and drop, because they can visually move their answer to the appropriate spot. And they can kind of learn by doing as they go along there. And again, with in tactile learners, very similarly, I want to make sure that regardless of what it is that I've done, whether it's a lot of text, whether it's videos, whether it's more visual material, that there is something where students can kind of learn by doing, so that it's very interactive in that way. Okay. So you just want to make sure that as you kind of work through H5P, one of the things that you are keeping in mind is how many can I integrate different ways of doing and different ways of having this content available for students or available for my users in a multiple different ways. Don't just choose one style of content. Don't just pick. You'll often find, that when you start using H5P, that you'll have a favorite content type. I certainly have mine, but you want to make sure that you're branching out a little bit and trying different things, just so that you can make sure that you're integrating multiple means of representation, multiple means of action expression, multiple means of engagement along the way. So H5P really is an easy way to incorporate universal design into your online learning objects and to make sure that your work is accessible to all. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch my screen and I am going to show you an example. So let's hope this works. All right. So you should be able to see my SY 103 library research for bibliography assignment content. So this is what is called in H5P an interactive book. So essentially what you are creating with an interactive book is a small textbook. Actually, I think you can make it as large as you sort of want. But on the side here, you'll sort of see a little table of contents where the students can come into and go through the different bits as they kind of go along. So I've broken up my session into individual chapters. So we sort of have getting help, and then we have developing, I believe, a research question, developing a research strategy, finding articles, and so on. So that way students can kind of come into it and say, oh, I know what I'm looking for. It's not just one large element. This way it's scaffolded where students they can come in and they can work through the individual processes they go. So for example, if I have a look at developing a research strategy, take it a second, there we go. So again, what I've really done is I've tried to scaffold and kind of break things up into chunks here. So I have on my first slide here is just an introductory slide. So I have my initial kind of blurb. Then on my next one, I have my next sort of steps that they may want to be thinking about. So again, this is very textual. This is very text-based. And now what I've sort of done is I've introduced, it's an image, but again, it's sort of text. And then I'm going to have an interactive element here. So we've walked through a couple of different points. So now I'm going to say, all right, based on the little image before, the little kind of like sentence before, I want you to think a little bit about what it is that you're doing here. And then on the next one, I again have a visual representation of what it is that I'm kind of looking for. And then on the next screen, I have a moment where they can actually interact with the material that I've put in here, and they can now start playing around with some of those ideas. So I've asked them to think a little bit about some of the material that I've talked about, and now they're going to get a chance to interact with that, and this allows them to play around with some of those different elements. Further down, you'll sort of see again that I have much the same sort of material here. I'll show you another example of something else that I've done. So if I have a look at developing a research question. So again, it's very similar to what I was doing before, very heavily based around, like I have some text here with, again, there should be a spot where they can write up their own research question, giving them a chance to kind of play around with some different tools and some different ideas. But then I also have a video that the library has created around developing a research question so that they can watch this rather than go through the individual text-based elements that I've kind of put in there in the course presentation. So I'm trying to find different ways to get them or get my students to not only work through the concept that I'm demonstrating here, but I've also given multiple different ways for them to enter into that content, to play around with that content and understand it. So as you kind of work with your H5P objects, it's, as Joanne said, it's a good idea to go into the process of developing whatever content type it is that you're thinking of and asking yourself, okay, I don't just want to do one thing. I don't just want to have a course presentation here. I don't just want to use this like a slideshow. I want to make sure that I'm integrating some different sorts of tools and interaction into my learning object to ensure that students, regardless of who's coming into it, can engage with it in some way. Okay, so I'm going to switch back into my slides now. Right, I guess we're going to look at it small. I'm sorry. So now that I've sort of talked a little bit about universal design for learning and how we can kind of integrate it into H5P, I'm going to very quickly cover just a little bit about doing some basic accessibility testing as you develop some of these objects. So you've kind of started thinking about accessibility, you've gone into H5P, you've made sure you've picked accessible learning objects, you've developed something with some UDL concepts in mind, and you've produced something. So now your next sort of step is to say, all right, how would I go about making absolutely sure that what it is that I've created is accessible? So to start, you just want to ask yourself a couple questions. First, can people use it if they can't see, hear, or use a mouse? So going back to that slide that Joanne had on the screen earlier with the three icons there, you want to kind of think to yourself, all right, if I cannot see something, how am I going to interact with it? Will a screen reader work with it? If I'm unable to hear a video, have I made sure to provide a transcript? If I can't use a mouse, how am I going to make sure that I can interact and move around on the particular object? So your key point here again is accessible content, making sure that your content is accessible, and providing information in multiple ways is sort of your key point. But you can do some basic checks. For example, with a keyboard test, perhaps you want to navigate by your keyboard only. So put your mouse away. So that when I'm doing a keyboard test, is I literally will put my mouse away, or I will disable the trackpad function on my laptop, so I'm not pulled in to try that. And I'll actually just try to work it through with the keyboard. So does the tab buttons work? Do the arrow buttons work? What about the enter keys? Making sure that all of these sorts of things work as you interact with your specific object. And so again, making sure that the keyboard works, plus making sure that you provide information in multiple ways is sort of a key basic test. Doing some screen reader simulators. So here you can have a look and find different screen readers, and I'll talk about an example in just a moment, but making sure that you kind of can put through your object through a screen reader to see if it captures everything. With the keyboard navigation, is everything recognized? Is everything read? Taking a look at different emulators or different simulators to see if the different pieces of information that you have on the screen is being caught by that simulator. So one fairly easy option, or one inexpensive option, is ChromeVox. So it is a screen reader put out by Google, and it's available, I believe, on Chrome. And you can set that up to see if the material that you are creating is going to be captured by a screen reader. So here, for example, the image hotspot that Joanne had up there earlier, is being captured by a Chromebox and being read aloud to the user. So you can find different ways to make sure that your H5P object is accessible. Of course, if you have a more advanced screen reader, for example, Java, or JAWS, you may want to put it through that as well. So using some of the different tools that you have available to you, try different things to see if it's going to be able to be captured by screen readers. Always, whenever you are working with any material, you always want to provide an alternative version. So as we sort of showed you here, we have sort of like the text version in PDF. So that is an alternative version. So anytime that I try to create a H5P object, I'm also asking myself, how can I make sure that I'm providing an alternative version to what it is that I'm doing? So much of the material that I create in H5P, I always will set aside as a transcript or write out my instructions so I can provide students if they request it. But always making sure that you have that alternative version ready to go and are able to provide it to your students when you need to. So at this point, we have about 15 minutes left. So we thought we would kind of open it up to the people in attendance and sort of ask you what sorts of questions or ideas or really getting some discussion going around accessibility and online learning. And if any of you have used any work with H5P in the past, we'd love to sort of hear from you, and we can have a conversation about H5P and accessibility. And I can see that Dan already has a question. He has many questions. So Laurier, we don't have a H5P subscription. We have a local implementation site. So when we started working with H5P a couple of years ago now, just before the pandemic, we really liked it. It worked really well with our platform. So what we decided to do is we created a local implementation within Laurier so that we could create it and kind of build out H5P for our library. Did I get all that right, Joanne?
Yes, and you can look at it if you want to.
I can show everyone what it kind of looks like.
I'll put it in the chat.
The screen's not loading. So here's our catalog. I'll just take a look at it. But we also have the link in the chat as well. These are all of the types of material that we have developed over time, and these are all publicly available. So if you wanted to go in, and they're all going to be under Creative Commons licenses as well. So, so CMS is a central management system.
We use Desire to Learn. So we have quite a few things embedded in there, I think, at this point. And number 3, where is the info stored? The info in terms of student responses and stuff is not really, I mean, there's some work that you can do with an LTI with Desire to Learn that we have not done yet, but have in our
Oh, Joanne, you cut out. Oh, we may have lost Joanne for a moment, so I'll pick up the that answer. So, oh, there she. You're back.
Okay, sorry about that. So, sorry, just very quick summary. I don't recommend using H5P if you need to see answers for something. It's really to help the students. It's to engage the students and get them to interact with the material and reflect. Is how I like to describe it. So it's not really like, if you need something that's going to show the answers to a quiz, then I find that I use the quiz in the learning management system or something like that instead.
Yeah, I use it very much to reinforce learning or to make sure that students are able to kind of like keep track of their learning as they go along, but it's not so much for assessment. And I'll take up Kelly's question about the interactive book because I've used it a fair bit. So it does provide students with a summary at the end. So at the end of every course presentation, or even at the bottom, actually, let me see if I can go back into my book and I can show you where it is. My internet is being very slow today, so I apologize for that. There it is. I think I'm just doing too much online with the conference and everything. So it's very slow. But yeah, so down here, you'll get a little button, summary and submit. So you're not submitting it to anyone, or the students aren't submitting it to anyone, but they will get a little PDF download of all of the answers that they provided as they kind of work through it. So I've had students who have told me that they've gone back multiple times into the book and have redone the sort of like little write-ups to develop a research question or something, just so that they then can have that as they develop and redevelop things.
Documentation tool is another H5P learning object that does something similar. So you can set it up. It's sort of like a Word document, or I mean, it's not, but students can fill in their answers and responses and then get a copy of that at the end. So that's something sort of similar.
And then Madeline asks, is the captioning added to videos automatically generated, or do you have to caption it yourself? We caption it ourselves.
We use Amara, which is a free online captioning tool.
Yeah. And I do know that some people also use Otter AI as well to create captions and things like that. So there's a number of different options out there. Dan, do you have the content backed up somewhere? A Word doc version of the text, quizzes, etc. So any information, do you mean sort of like the answers or the quizzes that we create?
I mean all of the production files, so that went into the creation of this, should you need to migrate it to a new platform at some point in time.
We have I just create my stuff directly in H5P at this point. So for the most part. For things like interactive videos, the answer would be yes. We do obviously have the video files and that kind of thing. For all of the, course presentations and columns and interactive books and stuff that I make, most of that stuff wouldn't be stuff that I would have in other formats first, I guess. So yes, we obviously have our server backups and that kind of thing for our H5P server, but I don't necessarily at this point worry too much about that. I'm sure I could figure out something if need be. I have great faith.
Any content that I create, so if I'm creating kind of like scripts or a lot of my things, I might develop in Word beforehand and then develop or put into H5P. But for the most part, if I'm creating, say, like a column or the interactive book or something like that, I'm just working in H5P. And then I'll, if I need to create a text-based version or an alternative format, I create that separately. And so that would be saved. But
I guess I'm less worried about it because we have our own local implementation. So that would be something that, we have more control over. Yes, Madeline, I like Amara too. I find it works really nicely.
do people have other questions or further thoughts? And don't be shy, you can put it in chat or just unmute yourself. If you do have further questions or want to just sort of talk about H5P or accessibility with us, and Joanne and I are more than happy to do so. You can get in touch with us via email, and I've thrown our emails up. Oh, Shannon had a question. Have you had any student feedback, Joanne?
I guess it's hard to, I mean, I have had positive student feedback. One of the very first times I used the H5P tool, it was to help with an assignment that the students were having a huge amount of difficulty with. And so I did a little course presentation just to kind of walk them through the steps. They had to like find a book and then find a review on that book. And they had to have some very narrow and specific topics that it was really hard to do that for. And so anyway, I walked them through a bunch of the steps through, with some screenshots and some text. And I sent that off to the faculty member and said, look, the students are having a terrible time. Could you send this out? And I subsequently got contacted by quite a number of students who all said that they had used it and found it helpful. So I've had anecdotal feedback on that, but I think because it kind of looks nice, it isn't just like a lot of our web pages on our website at least are very like text heavy, and so this lets us kind of present things in a little bit more visual way sometimes, or in using different formats as Matt described. And so I think it looks a little more appealing to students as well. So I have found that, I mean, just anecdotally, that I've had more luck getting students to look at it, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm much the same. I've had a lot of very good feedback from the interactive books that I've used this semester with students kind of navigating for the first time, many of them larger essay projects. And I've gotten some good feedback that it was a really nice way for them to kind of work through the process of preparing for research. And so I think that that's been, again, very anecdotal, but I've had a lot of good feedback from faculty who have now started asking for more of similar things, which is both great and it means more work. But I also have a bank of stuff kind of saved up. And then students also have sort of been saying we really like what the usability of this. So.
One of the things that I've started using it for, and this is, after having used it now for a few years, is I've done, I get so many reference questions that are all about the same thing. And so I've started to get, especially for certain classes, so I've started to do quick H5P learning objects that cover different things that I get a lot of reference questions about. And then I can either just, if students email me or whatever, at this point I'm not seeing students in person yet, then I can send, I can respond to them, but I can also send them to the H5P learning object. So I'm finding that I can use it kind of more informally one-on-one with students that way, as well as Matt said, if you have like a bank of these things, and I can use it for formal instruction, or I can just refer students to it during reference interactions if I know that those are going to be common things as well. So I find it, after a while, building up a kind of a critical mass of them can be really helpful, because you can reuse and recombine them in different ways.
So we have about 6 minutes left. Is there any other questions that people would like to throw our way? Yes, all of our H5Ps are available for reusing. As long as you just follow all of them are under Creative Commons licenses that we've all chosen what we want. So, but if you want to reuse anything that we've put together, you're more than welcome to.
Yeah, as long as people, I mean, we have a range of licenses that people can choose from. So as long as people have given permission, then yeah, absolutely go ahead.
I know that anything that I've created, I've just sort of said, as long as you're not making money off of it, you're free to use it.
Thanks, everybody. If
Thank
you have
you,
questions
everyone.
afterwards, please feel free to ask.
Yeah. And I will turn it over to Kelly now. I know that we have the showcase next, so thank you all for your time and attention.